Richard Harrington stared out the window of his town car as it wound its way up the long, tree-lined driveway toward his estate. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn, splashing the landscape with bursts of gold and crimson. He should have found it beautiful. Instead, he felt nothing. The car rolled to a stop at the front entrance of his sprawling mansion. "We're home early, sir," his driver announced, breaking the silence. "Only 7:30, Richard nodded absently. His business meeting in Chicago had concluded ahead of schedule, and he'd caught an earlier flight back. Not that it mattered. There was nothing waiting for him here except empty rooms and silence. "Thank you, Howard. That will be all for tonight," Richard said, collecting his briefcase. At 58, he moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades maximizing every minute. His salt and pepper hair was precisely cut, his custom suit unwrinkled despite the day of travel. Everything about him spoke of wealth, success, and careful control. Howard retrieved Richard's overnight bag from the trunk. "Will you need anything else this evening, sir?" "No. Enjoy your weekend." Richard took his bags and climbed the wide stone steps to his front door. The house loomed before him, a 17-room Tudor-style mansion that had been featured in architectural magazines and had cost him more than his first tech company. He'd bought it 10 years ago during the height of his success when he still had someone to share it with. Now it was just space. Empty, echoing space. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, expecting the usual stillness. The staff would be gone by now. They knew his schedule and wouldn't expect him until tomorrow. The housekeeper, the groundskeeper, and the new maid he'd barely met would have finished their work hours ago. But the house wasn't silent. Richard froze in the marble-floored entryway, his hand still on the door handle. Music, piano music, drifted through the house. Not recorded music from his expensive sound system, but the unmistakable sound of his rarely touched Steinway grand piano being played live, and not just played with extraordinary skill. The piece wasn't one he recognized immediately, something modern with classical influences. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, complex but accessible, with an underlying current of longing that seemed to reach directly into his chest and squeeze. Richard set down his bags quietly and moved toward the sound. Drawn by curiosity and something else he couldn't name, the music grew louder as he approached the grand salon where the piano sat, largely unused since Elaine had passed away 5 years ago. He'd kept it tuned out of some sense of obligation to her memory, but no one had really played it since. Until now. He paused at the partially open double doors, peering through the gap. In the soft glow of a single lamp, a young woman sat at the piano, her back to him, completely absorbed in the music she was creating. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore what looked like a gray uniform dress, the kind his housekeeping staff wore. The maid. It had to be the new one, Elena something. He'd barely glanced at her paperwork when his house manager had hired her 3 weeks ago. Some immigrant from Eastern Europe with decent references. That's all he knew. What he hadn't known, couldn't have known, was that she played like this. Richard stood motionless, afraid that if he moved, the spell would break. Her hands danced across the keys with a fluidity that spoke of years of training, but it wasn't just technical skill. There was emotion in every note, a story being told through the rise and fall of the melody. Joy, sorrow, yearning. It was all there, pouring from her fingertips. When was the last time he had felt anything so deeply? Richard couldn't remember. The piece built to a crescendo, her whole body swaying slightly with the intensity of it, before softening into a gentle, questioning conclusion that hung in the air like an unfinished conversation. In the silence that followed, Richard found himself holding his breath. The young woman remained still for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the keys. Then she sighed, a small sound in the large room, and her shoulders slumped slightly. He should say something, Richard knew. Announce his presence. Ask what she was doing playing his piano without permission. That would be the expected response. The Richard Harrington response. The response of a man who had built a technology empire on control and precision. Instead, he heard himself ask softly, "What was that piece?" The young woman gasped and spun around on the piano bench, nearly falling off in her surprise. "Mr. Harrington!" Her eyes were wide with alarm, a rich brown against her olive skin. "I am so sorry, you weren't supposed to." Her accent was noticeable but not thick. Her English fluent but clearly not her first language. "It's all right," Richard said, surprising himself again. He stepped fully into the room. "I just asked what you were playing. I didn't recognize it." Elena, yes, that was her name, Elena Novak, stood up quickly, smoothing down her uniform dress with visibly trembling hands. She looked young, mid-20s perhaps, with a face that would have been plain if not for those expressive eyes, now filled with apprehension. "It is called Memories of Home," she said hesitantly. "By composer from my country. Not famous outside." She swallowed hard. "I am very sorry, Mr. Harrington. I know I should not touch. I was finishing early and I saw a piano and I just—" Her voice trailed off. "You just couldn't resist." Richard finished for her. He understood that feeling, or at least he once had. There had been a time when he'd been passionate about things. Before spreadsheets and profit margins had consumed his life. "Yes," she admitted, looking down at her feet. "I will get my things and go. You will want new Maid, I understand." Richard walked closer to the piano, running his fingers lightly over its polished surface. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Elena looked up, confusion crossing her features. She had expected anger, not curiosity. "In conservatory back home. Before I had to leave." "You studied professionally?" She nodded cautiously. "For 3 years. I had scholarship. But then my mother got sick and medical bill." She shrugged, a small resigned gesture. "I came to America to find work. Better pay here." Richard nodded slowly. The story wasn't unique. People giving up dreams for practical realities. What was unique was the talent he'd just witnessed. "And now you clean houses." A flash of something, pride perhaps, crossed her face. "I do honest work, Mr. Harrington. I am good at my job." "I didn't suggest otherwise," Richard said. "I'm just trying to understand how someone with your level of talent ends up as a housemaid." "Life happens," she said simply. "We adjust." Richard felt an unexpected smile tug at his lips. "Yes, we do." He moved to one of the plush armchairs near the piano and sat down, gesturing to the bench. "Please, sit. You don't need to leave." Elena hesitated, clearly unsure if this was a test. When Richard made no move to change his mind, she perched tentatively on the edge of the piano bench. "How long have you been playing?" he asked. "Since I was 6, she replied, relaxing slightly as she realized he wasn't going to fire her immediately. "My grandmother taught me first. She played in orchestra many years ago. And that piece you were playing, it reminded you of home?" A soft, sad smile touched her lips. "Yes, it is about remembering places that no longer exist except in memory." She glanced at the piano with undisguised longing. "I don't get to play often now. Maybe at church sometimes if regular pianist is sick." She looked up at him. "Your piano is beautiful. Perfect condition." "My late wife was a pianist," Richard heard himself say. He rarely mentioned Elaine to anyone, especially not to staff. Not professional, but very dedicated. She played daily. "I am sorry for your loss," Elena said, and the genuine empathy in her voice made Richard look away momentarily. "It's been 5 years," he said, as if that explained everything, as if time alone could heal all wounds. An awkward silence fell between them. Elena fidgeted with the edge of her uniform. "I should go," she said finally. "It is late and you just arrive home. You want peace. Peace." Was that what he had in this big empty house, or just absence of noise? "Play something else," Richard said abruptly. Elena's eyes widened. "Excuse me?" "Play something else," he repeated more gently this time. "Please. It's been a long time since this piano was played properly." She studied him for a long moment as if trying to determine his motives. Whatever she saw in his face must have reassured her because she turned back to the keyboard. "What would you like to hear?" Richard leaned back in his chair, suddenly tired in a way that had nothing to do with his business trip. "Whatever you want to play," he said. "Something that matters to you." Elena nodded, and after a moment's thought her hands returned to the keys. This time she began with something Richard recognized immediately, Debussy's Clair de Lune. But there was nothing routine about her interpretation. She played with a delicate touch that made the familiar piece sound newly discovered, each note hanging in the air like moonlight on water. As the music filled the room, Richard closed his eyes. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something stir within him, a faint echo of the man he used to be before success had hollowed him out, before loss had taught him to stop feeling altogether. And in that moment, in the most unexpected way, Richard Harrington's life began to change. The next morning, Richard woke earlier than usual. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in his bedroom curtains, painting bright lines across the hardwood floor. For the first time in months, he felt a quiet anticipation about the day ahead. He dressed casually, weekend clothes, jeans, and a simple button-down shirt, and made his way downstairs. The house was quiet except for distant sounds coming from the kitchen. He followed them, drawn by the smell of coffee. Mrs. Chen, his longtime housekeeper, looked up in surprise when he appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Harrington, we weren't expecting you until this afternoon." "Change of plans," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Is Elena here today?" Mrs. Chen nodded as she arranged fresh flowers in a vase. "Yes, sir. She's upstairs doing the guest bedrooms." Richard nodded, trying to appear casual. "When she's finished, would you send her to my study?" "Of course." Mrs. Chen gave him a curious look but asked no questions. That was one of the many reasons he'd kept her on for over a decade. She was efficient and discreet. In his study, Richard found himself unable to focus on the financial reports he'd brought home. Instead, he kept thinking about the music he'd heard last night and the sad, simple way Elena had explained giving up her dreams. Life happens. We adjust. An hour later, there was a soft knock on his study door. "Come in," he called, setting aside the papers he hadn't really been reading. Elena entered cautiously, her eyes downcast. She wore the same gray uniform as yesterday, her hair once again in a simple ponytail. "Mrs. Chen said you wanted to see me, sir." Her voice was quiet, resigned. She clearly expected to be fired. "Yes, please sit down." Richard gestured to the chair across from his desk. She perched on the edge of the seat, hands folded tightly in her lap. "About last night." "Tell me about your training," Richard interrupted. "Your musical education." Elena blinked, thrown off balance by the question. "My training?" "Yes, you said you studied at a conservatory." "For how long? What was your focus?" 3 years, she said slowly, confusion evident on her face. "I was studying to be concert pianist. Classical performance was my focus, but I also studied composition." "And you had to leave because of your mother's illness?" Elena nodded, a flicker of old pain crossing her features. "She had cancer. Treatment was very expensive. The scholarship covered my tuition, but not living expenses for both of us. And she needed me at home." She shrugged, that same small, resigned gesture from the night before. "So I left school. And your mother now?" "She is better. The treatments worked, but left her weak. She lives with my aunt back home. I send money every month." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her. In the daylight, he could see details he'd missed the night before. She was thin, too thin, like someone who worked hard and ate little. Her uniform, though clean and pressed, was slightly worn at the cuffs. The only hint of personality in her practical appearance was a small, silver music note pendant that hung from a simple chain around her neck. "How many jobs do you work, Elena?" She hesitated, as if worried about the right answer. 3, she admitted finally. "Here 3 days a week. Another house on Tuesdays. And weekend shifts at a restaurant downtown." "And when do you practice? Your piano playing?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. "When I can. Sometimes at church when it's empty. Sometimes at houses I clean if they have piano and I finish early." Her eyes widened suddenly. "But I never neglect my work, Mr. Harrington. I always finish all tasks first." "I believe you," Richard said. He tapped his fingers on his desk, thinking. "How would you like to play my piano?" Elena stared at him. "I don't understand." "It's a simple offer," Richard said. "That piano hasn't been played properly in 5 years. It's a waste. You clearly have extraordinary talent. You should play it. You want me to play your piano?" She repeated, as if certain she was misunderstanding. "Yes. After you finish your work, of course. Or before you start, if you prefer. The point is the piano should be played. You need somewhere to practice." "It's a practical arrangement." Elena looked at him with open suspicion now. "Why would you offer this?" The question caught Richard off guard. He was used to people accepting his offers without question, grateful for whatever crumbs might fall from his table. But here was this young woman, a maid with 3 jobs and barely enough money to send home to her sick mother, looking at him like she was the one who needed to be convinced. "Because I heard you play," he said finally. Because talent like yours shouldn't be wasted. Because my wife would have wanted her piano to be played by someone who understands music the way you do. Elena studied him for a long moment. It is very kind offer, she said finally. But what? Rich men don't just let maids play expensive pianos without wanting something in return, she said bluntly. Richard felt himself flush with unexpected embarrassment. Of course she would think that. What else would she think? I'm not, he began, then stopped, reconsidering his words. I understand your concern. My offer has no strings attached. Mrs. Chen is always here when you are. The doors to the room stay open. You can come and go as you please, he paused. I just want the piano to be played again. Elena still looked uncertain, but the longing in her eyes when she glanced toward the direction of the grand salon was unmistakable. Think about it, Richard said. The offer stands whenever you want to accept it. She nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Harrington. She stood, smoothing her uniform. I should get back to work now. Of course. She had almost reached the door when Richard called after her. Elena? She turned. Yes? That piece you played last night by the composer from your country, do you have the sheet music for it? She shook her head. No, I play from memory. But I could write it down if you want. I'd like that, Richard said. After she left, Richard sat for a long time, staring out the window at his manicured gardens. What was he doing? Was this really about the piano? Or was it about the strange feeling he'd had last night listening to her play? The feeling that for a few minutes he'd been alive again? 3 days passed before Richard heard the piano again. He was working in his home office when the faint sound of music reached him. Setting aside his laptop, he followed the melody. This time, the doors to the grand salon were partly open. Elena sat at the piano, playing something rich and complex. Bach, he thought, though he couldn't identify the specific piece. Mrs. Chen was dusting bookshelves on the far side of the room, her presence a silent chaperone. Richard paused in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. Elena played with the same passion he'd witnessed before, but there was something different now. A confidence, perhaps, knowing she had permission to be there. As if sensing his presence, she looked up. Her hands faltered momentarily on the keys, but when he smiled encouragingly, she continued playing, bringing the piece to its natural conclusion. That was beautiful, Richard said when she finished. Thank you, she replied. There was less fear in her eyes now, though still plenty of caution. I didn't mean to interrupt. Please continue if you'd like. Elena hesitated. Actually, I wrote down that piece for you. The one from my country. She reached for some papers resting on top of the piano. It's not professional quality, but all notes are there. Richard crossed the room and took the handwritten sheet music. Her notation was precise and elegant. You did this from memory? She nodded. I have good ear, and I've played it many times. Richard studied the music, impressed not just by her memory but by the composition itself. Who wrote this? A faint blush colored Elena's cheeks. I did, Richard looked up sharply. You? She nodded again. It was my final project before I left conservatory. About memories of my childhood village. You're a composer as well as a pianist. It wasn't a question. I try to be, Elena said, when I have time. She glanced at the clock on the wall, which I don't have much of now. I should finish my work. Of course, Richard said. But Elena, she paused, looking back at him. Would you consider playing this piece at a small gathering I'm hosting next weekend? My home, about 20 guests. Business associates, mostly. I would pay you, of course. Elena's eyes widened. You want me to perform? For your guests? Yes, they'd appreciate real talent. And it would be a change from the usual string quartets I hire. He named a figure that was more than she likely made in a week of cleaning houses. She looked torn. I don't know, Mr. Harrington. I haven't performed in public for years, and I don't have proper clothes for such event. We can solve that problem easily enough, Richard said. And as for performing, well, consider this a private home, not a concert hall. Just a few people listening while they sip their champagne. Elena smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her serious face. You make it sound so simple. Sometimes things are simple, Richard replied, though he knew better. Nothing about this situation was simple, least of all the reasons why he was making this offer. Okay, Elena said finally. I will play at your party. Excellent, Richard said, feeling an unexpected surge of pleasure at her acceptance. We'll work out the details later. After she left to finish her cleaning, Richard found himself standing at the piano, looking at the sheet music she'd written out for him. Memories of Home by Elena Novak. His finger traced the neatly written notes. How many other compositions had she created? How many more might she create given the chance? For the first time in years, Richard Harrington felt a spark of genuine curiosity about another person's potential. And with that curiosity came a strange, almost forgotten sensation, the desire to make something happen, something beyond profit margins and business expansions, something that mattered. The week leading up to Richard's gathering passed quickly. Elena came to the house for her regular cleaning days, and each time, she stayed a little longer afterward to practice on the piano. Richard found himself arranging his schedule to be home during these times, pretending to work in nearby rooms while secretly listening. The day before the party, Richard was on a conference call in his study when Mrs. Chen knocked on his door. "Excuse me, Mr. Harrington," she said when he muted the call. "Ms. Novak is here. She says you asked to see her about tomorrow." Richard nodded. "Yes, thank you. Please send her in." He quickly wrapped up his call and closed his laptop just as Elena appeared in the doorway. She looked different today. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves past her shoulders, and instead of her gray uniform, she wore simple jeans and a blue sweater. Without the shapeless work clothes, Richard could see she was actually quite lovely, in a quiet, unassuming way. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Harrington?" she asked. "Yes, please come in." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "About tomorrow, I've been thinking. Playing your own composition is wonderful, but perhaps you should also include something more recognizable, for variety." Elena tilted her head thoughtfully. "What did you have in mind?" "I was thinking perhaps some Chopin. His nocturnes always go over well at these events." A small, amused smile played at her lips. "You want background music? Pretty sounds while people talk?" Richard felt himself flush slightly. "I didn't mean—" "It's okay," Elena said. "I understand. I'll play Nocturne in E-flat major. Everyone knows this one, even if they don't know they know it. And then my piece after, when they are warmed up." "That sounds perfect," Richard said. "Now about your dress for tomorrow." "I have something," she interrupted quickly. "Nothing fancy, but clean and nice." Richard hesitated. He'd been planning to offer to buy her something appropriate, but her proud expression stopped him. "I'm sure it will be fine. The car will pick you up at 6. "Car?" Elena's eyebrows rose. "I can take the bus, Mr. Harrington." "Nonsense. It's across town and you'll have your music to carry. The car will bring you here and then we'll all go to the venue together." Elena looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she just nodded. "Thank you." As she turned to leave, Richard called after her. "Elena?" She paused in the doorway. "Yes? Have you written other pieces? Besides Memories of Home?" A shadow passed over her face. "Many. But most of the sheets were left behind when I came to America. I didn't have room for everything. But you remember them? Like you remembered this one?" She tapped her temple. "They're all still here. Some days when I'm cleaning or waiting for the bus, I play them in my head." The thought made something twist in Richard's chest. All that music trapped inside her, played only in silence as she scrubbed other people's floors. "I'd like to hear them sometime," he said. Elena studied him with those serious brown eyes. "Why are you doing all this, Mr. Harrington?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "Doing what?" "The piano. The performance, being kind." Richard wasn't sure how to answer. The truth was he didn't fully understand his own motivations. Was it pity? Admiration? Or something else, a need to feel something, anything after years of emotional numbness? "I suppose," he said slowly, "I recognize something valuable that shouldn't be wasted." Elena held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "I should go. I have another job this afternoon." After she left, Richard sat staring at the closed door, wondering what she'd seen in his face when he'd given his answer. The next evening, Richard paced in his foyer, checking his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. The gathering was at a small, exclusive gallery downtown, where he was considering making an investment. His business partners and their spouses would be there, along with some of the artists featured in the gallery. The car he'd sent for Elena should have arrived by now. Had she changed her mind? Just as he was about to call his driver, the front door opened and Elena stepped inside. Richard's breath caught. She wore a simple black dress, modest but elegant, that fell just below her knees. Her hair was swept up in a graceful twist, revealing small silver earrings that matched her music note necklace. She looked nervous but determined, clutching a folder of sheet music to her chest. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said. "There was traffic." "You're not late at all," Richard said, trying not to stare. "You look very nice." A faint blush touched her cheeks. "Thank you." "The dress was my mother's. I had it altered." Before Richard could respond, Mrs. Chen appeared with his coat, and moments later, they were in the back of his town car, heading downtown. Elena sat stiffly beside him, gazing out the window at the city lights. "Are you nervous about tonight?" Richard asked. "A little," she admitted. "It's been a long time since I performed for anyone who was actually listening." "You'll be wonderful," Richard said, and meant it. She turned to look at him. "Why do you believe in me so much?" "You barely know me." The question hung in the air between them. Why indeed? Richard wasn't sure he could explain it even to himself. "I heard you play," he said simply. "Sometimes that's enough." The gallery was already buzzing with conversation when they arrived. Waiters circulated with champagne and small plates of food. Richard's business partner, Thomas, approached them immediately. "Richard, glad you could make it." His curious gaze shifted to Elena. "Thomas, this is Elena Novak," Richard said. "She'll be performing for us tonight." "Ah, the pianist." Richard mentioned he'd found someone special. Thomas shook her hand. "Looking forward to it." As Richard introduced Elena to the other guests, he watched their reactions. Most were politely interested, but a few, those who knew something about music, looked slightly skeptical. A young woman in her 30s who had served on the symphony board raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "And where did you study, Ms. Novak?" she asked. "Warsaw Conservatory," Elena replied. "For 3 years. How interesting." "And what brings you to our little city?" "Life," Elena said with the same simple directness Richard had come to expect from her. "Sometimes we go where opportunity takes us." The woman smiled blandly and turned away, already losing interest. Richard felt a flare of irritation on Elena's behalf. At 8 o'clock, the gallery owner announced it was time for the musical portion of the evening. The guests gathered around the grand piano that had been placed at one end of the main showroom. Elena walked to the piano with quiet dignity, her back straight, her chin lifted slightly. She sat down, arranged her music, and took a breath. Richard held his own breath as her fingers touched the keys. The first notes of Chopin's familiar nocturne filled the room. Elena played beautifully, her technique flawless, but Richard sensed she was holding something back. This was Elena performing, not Elena lost in the music as she'd been that first night. The guests listened appreciatively, sipping their champagne. When she finished the nocturne, there was polite applause. Elena nodded in acknowledgement, then turned the page in her music. "The next piece," she said, her voice soft but clear, "is one of my own compositions. It's called Memories of Home." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Most had assumed she was just another hired performer, not a composer. The first notes of her piece rose into the air. That same hauntingly beautiful melody Richard had heard that first night. But now, watching her play, he could see the transformation that came over her. Her body relaxed, her face softened, and her hands moved across the keys with a kind of joyful freedom. The piece told a story without words, of childhood, of loss, of longing for places and people left behind. As the final notes faded away, there was a moment of complete silence in the gallery. Then the applause started, not the polite, obligatory kind from before, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. Richard saw several guests exchange impressed glances. The symphony board woman was staring at Elena with new interest. Thomas appeared at Richard's elbow. "Where on earth did you find her?" he asked in a low voice. "She works for me," Richard replied, not taking his eyes off Elena. "She cleans my house." Thomas looked at him sharply. "You're joking." "Not at all." "Well, she shouldn't be cleaning houses, that's for sure." That was remarkable. People were gathering around the piano now, congratulating Elena. She looked overwhelmed by the attention, smiling shyly as she answered their questions. The gallery owner was speaking animatedly to her, gesturing with his hands. Richard hung back, watching. There was a strange feeling in his chest. Pride, yes, but also something like sadness. This was where she belonged in this world of art and music, not scrubbing floors and dusting shelves. Later, as the evening was winding down, Elena found him standing alone by one of the paintings. "Mr. Harrington," she said softly, "thank you for tonight." "You were wonderful," he said. Everyone was impressed. The gallery owner asked if I would play at their next opening, she said, a note of wonder in her voice. And a woman, I think she works with the symphony, asked if I have other compositions. "That's great," Richard said, genuinely pleased for her. "What did you tell them?" I said I would think about it. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had just created such beauty. "I'm not sure how I would fit it in with my jobs." The opportunity was there, hanging between them. Richard took a breath. "Elena, I'd like to make you an offer." Elena looked at Richard with cautious eyes. "What kind of offer?" Richard glanced around the gallery. People were still mingling, sipping the last of their champagne. But he wanted privacy for this conversation. "Let's talk outside," he suggested, guiding her toward the small courtyard at the back of the gallery. The night air was cool but not cold, and string lights twinkled in the trees overhead. They sat on a stone bench, far enough from the building that their conversation wouldn't be overheard. "I want to sponsor you," Richard said, deciding directness was best. "Pay for you to return to your studies. Cover your living expenses so you can focus on your music." Elena stared at him, her face unreadable in the dim light. "Why would you do that?" "Because you have a gift that shouldn't be wasted scrubbing floors and waiting tables." He leaned forward slightly. "Do you know how rare true talent is? I've spent my life around people who are good at making money but creating something beautiful, something that moves people. That's much rarer." Elena was silent for a long moment. "And what would you want in return?" The question hung in the air between them. Richard understood her suspicion. A wealthy man offering to pay for a young woman's education rarely came without strings attached. "Nothing," he said firmly. "No strings, no obligations. I'd set up a trust with specific parameters: tuition, housing, living expenses. You'd report to a board of trustees, not to me. Your only responsibility would be to study and create music." Elena shook her head slowly, as if trying to process his words. "But why? Why me?" Richard looked up at the night sky, searching for words to explain feelings he barely understood himself. "My wife, Elaine, was a pianist," he said finally. "Not professional, she taught music at a private school. But she was passionate about it. When she died, I lost touch with that part of my life. Lost touch with a lot of things, if I'm being honest." He looked back at Elena. "Hearing you play that first night, it was like waking up after a long sleep. I realized how much beauty I'd shut out of my life." Elena's expression softened. "I'm sorry about your wife." "It was 5 years ago," Richard said. "Cancer. We had 10 good years together before that. And no children?" "No, we wanted them, but he shrugged. It wasn't meant to be." Elena was quiet for a moment, then asked, "This trust, it would pay for school? Back in Europe? Wherever you want to study. Whatever program you choose. The best schools in the world would be lucky to have you. And my mother, she still needs support. That would be included. Medical care, housing, whatever she needs." Elena stood up suddenly and walked a few steps away, her back to Richard. Her shoulders were tense, and he could see her hands clenched at her sides. "It's too much," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Too big a gift from someone who barely knows me." Richard stayed seated, giving her space. "It's not as selfless as it sounds," he admitted. "There's something healing about reconnecting with music through your talent. Maybe I need this as much as you do." Elena turned back to face him. In the soft glow of the string lights, he could see the conflict in her eyes. Hope warring with pride, suspicion with desperate longing. "I would have to think about it," she said finally. "Talk to my mother." "Of course," Richard said. "Take all the time you need." The drive back to Richard's house was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Elena gathered her music folder. "I can take a taxi home," she said. "Nonsense. Howard will drive you." Richard hesitated, then added, "Whatever you decide about my offer, the piano is still yours to play whenever you want." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "You're a strange man, Mr. Harrington." "So I've been told," he replied with a small smile. 3 days passed without word from Elena. Richard tried to focus on work, but found himself distracted, wondering what she was thinking, whether she would accept his offer. He was surprised by how much it mattered to him. On the fourth day, Mrs. Chen knocked on his study door. "Ms. Novak is here to see you, sir." Richard's heart jumped. "Send her in." Elena entered wearing her cleaning uniform. Her face was composed, but there was a new steadiness in her gaze. "I've thought about your offer," she said without preamble. "And," Richard tried to keep his voice neutral, "I can't accept it as you proposed it." Richard felt a sharp stab of disappointment. "May I ask why?" "Because I don't want charity," Elena said. "I don't want to be a project, even a well-intentioned one." "It's not charity," Richard began, but Elena held up a hand. "Please, let me finish." "I can't accept your offer as it stands, but I have a counter-proposal." Richard leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "I'm listening." "Instead of a gift, I want a loan," Elena said. "I'll accept your financial support to return to school, but as an investment. When I'm established, whether as a performer, composer, or teacher, I'll pay you back." With interest, Richard studied her face. Her chin was raised slightly, her eyes direct and challenging. "That could take years," he pointed out. "Possibly decades." "Yes," she agreed. "But it would be a business arrangement, not charity. And I would maintain my independence." A small smile tugged at Richard's lips. In his world of yes-men and sycophants, her stubborn pride was refreshing. "All right," he said, "a loan with very favorable terms. We can work out the details." Some of the tension left Elena's shoulders. "There's one more condition, which is, I want to perform," she said, "regularly while I study. Not just at schools or competitions, but for real people. I've spent too long playing only for myself." "Music should be shared." "I couldn't agree more," Richard said. "We can arrange recitals, small concerts. And for people who wouldn't normally hear classical music," Elena continued. "Schools in poor neighborhoods, community centers, nursing homes." Her eyes were bright with conviction. Music belongs to everyone, not just people who can afford gallery showings. Richard felt something warm unfurl in his chest. This was what had drawn him to her from the beginning. Not just her talent, but her genuine passion for music itself. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said. "We can make it part of the Foundation's mission." Elena's brow furrowed. "Foundation?" "Well, we'll need some sort of legal structure for all this," Richard explained. "A foundation would be cleaner than a personal loan. We can set it up with a board of directors, people we both trust to oversee everything." Elena considered this. "And this foundation would support other musicians too?" "Not just me." Richard hadn't thought that far, but the idea immediately felt right. "Yes, eventually. We could establish scholarships, fund community programs, help talented people who have to give up their dreams because of money." Elena finished softly. Their eyes met in shared understanding. This was no longer just about one talented maid and a lonely millionaire. It was about creating something larger than both of them. "So," Richard said, "do we have an agreement?" Elena nodded, a smile breaking across her face like sunrise. "Yes, Mr. Harrington, we have an agreement." The next 6 months transformed both their lives. Richard threw himself into establishing the Elaine Harrington Music Foundation with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt for any project in years. Elena gave notice at her other jobs and began preparing for auditions at top conservatories, practicing for hours each day on Richard's piano. Together they organized her first official recital, a fundraiser for the foundation, held in a small but prestigious concert hall downtown. Richard watched with pride as Elena captivated the audience with both classical pieces and her own compositions. The standing ovation she received brought tears to his eyes. As the months passed, their relationship evolved. The careful formality between them gradually gave way to a warm friendship, built on mutual respect and shared passion for the Foundation's mission. Elena still called him Mr. Harrington in public, but in private she'd begun to use his first name, rolling the R slightly with her accent. Richard found himself looking forward to their meetings about the Foundation, to their discussions about music and art. There was an easiness between them now, a comfortable give and take that he hadn't experienced with anyone in years. One evening, about 8 months after that first night he'd heard her play, they were sitting in his study, reviewing applications for the Foundation's first scholarship program. Elena had been accepted to 3 prestigious conservatories and would be leaving for Vienna in a few weeks. Richard was trying not to think about how quiet the house would be without her regular visits. "I think this one," Elena said, pushing a folder across the desk, the young cellist from Detroit. His teacher's recommendation letter made me cry. Richard skimmed the application. 16 years old, already playing with the youth symphony. Yes, he looks promising. Elena smiled. When I come back for Christmas, I want to meet him. Maybe we can play together at the holiday benefit. You're coming back for Christmas? Richard tried to keep the pleased surprise out of his voice. Of course, she said, as if it were obvious. I wouldn't miss the Foundation's first big event. She paused, then added more softly. And I promised Mrs. Chen I'd play carols on the piano. Richard smiled. She'd be devastated if you didn't. Elena studied him for a moment, her head tilted slightly. You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just a rich man with a guilty conscience. And now? Richard asked, curious. Now I know you're a rich man with a good heart who was just lost for a while. The simple truth of her words caught him off guard. And you? What were you before we met? Elena considered this. A dreamer who had given up on her dreams. She smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you for helping me find them again. Thank you, Richard replied, for helping me find mine. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, dusting the garden with white. Inside, the study was warm, filled with the companionable silence of two people who had found in each other something neither had expected, a new beginning. 2 years had passed since that first night. Richard heard Elena playing his piano. The seasons had changed 8 times, bringing with them transformations neither could have imagined when they first met. The grand concert hall buzzed with anticipation. Every seat was filled, from the expensive orchestra section to the highest balcony. Programs rustled as people flipped through pages, reading about tonight's soloist and the special premiere piece. Backstage, Richard straightened his bow tie, trying to calm the nervous flutter in his stomach. He wasn't the one performing tonight, yet somehow he felt more anxious than he had before any business presentation in his life. Mr. Harrington, a young stagehand, appeared at his elbow. They're ready for you. Richard nodded and followed the young man through the maze of backstage corridors. He'd been in this building countless times over the past 2 years, attending Foundation events and watching Elena's performances when she returned from Vienna. But tonight was different. Tonight was the culmination of everything. He stepped onto the stage and blinked against the bright lights. Applause greeted him as he approached the microphone. Good evening, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. Thank you all for coming tonight to this special performance benefiting the Elaine Harrington Music Foundation. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Among them were students who'd received foundation scholarships, community music teachers whose programs they'd funded, and many of the city's wealthy elite who'd become enthusiastic donors. When we established this foundation 2 years ago, we had a simple mission: to ensure that extraordinary musical talent would never be lost due to financial circumstances. To date, we've provided 48 scholarships to young musicians, funded 15 community music programs, and donated instruments to 28 schools in underserved areas. More applause rippled through the audience. Richard smiled, pride warming his chest. Tonight is special not only because of the extraordinary talent you're about to hear, but because it represents a journey that began with an unexpected moment. Sometimes the most important things in life happen when we least expect them. He took a breath. It is my great honor to introduce a woman whose talent changed not only her own life, but the lives of countless others through her music and her work with our foundation. Please welcome, making her debut as a soloist with the City Symphony Orchestra, pianist and composer Elena Novak. The audience erupted in applause as Richard stepped aside. Elena walked onto the stage, a vision in a deep blue gown that sparkled subtly under the lights. Her hair was swept up elegantly, and the silver music note necklace she'd worn since Richard first met her gleamed at her throat. She didn't look like a housemaid anymore. She looked like exactly what she was, an acclaimed pianist on the rise, already gathering attention in European music circles, now returning to make her mark in the city where her second chance had begun. Elena acknowledged the audience with a graceful nod, then turned to Richard. Their eyes met, and a world of understanding passed between them. She gave him a small, private smile before turning to the conductor and taking her place at the grand piano. Richard slipped off the stage and found his seat in the front row, just as the conductor raised his baton. The orchestra began the opening notes of Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1, one of the most beloved and challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. When Elena joined in, her fingers dancing across the keys with confident precision, Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was the same woman who had once cleaned his floors, who had played his piano in secret when she thought no one was listening. Now she commanded the stage, her talent recognized and celebrated. Through the first movement, Elena played with technical brilliance and emotional depth that held the audience spellbound. Richard found himself leaning forward in his seat, watching her hands, her face, the way she communicated with the conductor and orchestra, as if they were having an intimate conversation through the music. During the brief pause between movements, the elderly woman seated beside Richard turned to him with shining eyes. "Remarkable," she whispered. "Where did you find her?" "In my living room," Richard replied with a small smile. "Playing my piano when she thought the house was empty." The woman's eyebrows rose in surprise, but before she could ask more questions, the orchestra began the second movement. Elena had worked tirelessly for this moment. 2 years of intensive study in Vienna, practicing until her fingers ached, absorbing everything her professors could teach her. She'd returned home regularly, both for foundation events and to visit her mother, who had moved to the city with Richard's help and now lived in a comfortable apartment near the best medical facilities. Richard had watched Elena's growth with a mixture of pride and awe. Her talent had always been there, but now it was polished, refined, expanded by the best education and opportunities. Yet she had retained the emotional honesty that had first captivated him, the ability to play not just with her hands but with her heart. The concerto drew to its thunderous conclusion, Elena's fingers flying across the keyboard in the final virtuosic passages. As the last chord resounded through the hall, there was a moment of breathless silence, and then the audience was on its feet, applauding wildly. Elena stood and bowed, her face flushed with exertion and joy. She acknowledged the conductor and orchestra, then turned back to the audience, her eyes finding Richard's. He applauded until his hands hurt, not bothering to hide the tears that had gathered in his eyes. After several curtain calls, the audience finally settled back into their seats. This was the moment Richard had been waiting for, the second half of the program. The conductor stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now have a very special premiere. Ms. Novak will perform her own composition, New Beginnings, accompanied by the orchestra. This piece was commissioned by the Elaine Harrington Music Foundation and is dedicated to its founder, Richard Harrington." Richard felt his breath catch. He knew Elena had been working on a new composition, but she had kept the details, including the dedication, a secret. Elena returned to the piano, pausing to give Richard a meaningful glance before sitting down. As her fingers touched the keys, a gentle melody emerged, hauntingly familiar. With a start, Richard recognized elements of Memories of Home, the piece she had played that first night in his house. But this was different, richer, more complex. Where Memories of Home had been filled with longing for the past, this new piece seemed to embrace both the bittersweet nostalgia of what had been lost and the hopeful promise of what was yet to come. As the orchestra joined in, the music blossomed, telling a story without words, a story of chance encounters, of hidden talents discovered, of lives intersecting and changing each other forever. Richard closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, hearing in every note the journey they had taken together. When the final, triumphant chord faded away, the silence that followed was profound, the kind that happens when an audience has been deeply moved. Then came the applause, even more enthusiastic than before, with shouts of "Bravo!" echoing through the hall. Elena stood accepting the acclaim with gracious bows. The conductor handed her a bouquet of flowers, and she clutched them to her chest, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. After the performance, a reception was held in the grand foyer. Richard stood to one side, watching as Elena was surrounded by admirers, critics, fellow musicians, foundation donors, all wanting to congratulate her and discuss her music. She handled the attention with grace, but he noticed how every few minutes her eyes would seek him out across the room, as if to anchor herself. Finally, as the crowd began to thin, Elena made her way to his side. "Well," she asked softly, "what did you think?" "It was beautiful," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. The best gift anyone has ever given me. Elena smiled. It seemed right. Your story and mine told through music. Our story, Richard corrected gently. She nodded. Yes, our story. A photographer approached, asking to take their picture for the Foundation's newsletter. They stood side by side, the millionaire and the former maid, now bound by friendship, mutual respect, and a shared vision that had touched hundreds of lives. Ms. Novak, the photographer said, your journey is quite remarkable, from cleaning houses to performing on the concert stage in just 2 years. How does it feel? Elena considered the question. Like coming home, she said finally, to the place I was always meant to be. As the reception wound down, Elena and Richard walked together through the quiet concert hall, their Fokker,